There is a peculiar kind of isolation that only exists at 3 in the morning, under the sickly buzz of fluorescent lights. It's the kind of isolation that makes you feel like the rest of the world has ceased to exist, leaving you stranded on a tiny, illuminated island in a sea of absolute darkness. I never intended to be at the Suds and Duds laundromat at 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. I am a creature of habit. I do my laundry on Sunday afternoons, folded neatly while watching bad television. But my apartment complex's pipes had burst. A foul, brown sludge had ruined my only clean work uniforms, and my shift at the hospital started at 6 in the morning. I had no choice. I gathered my soaked, awful-smelling clothes into a plastic garbage bag and drove the 3 miles to the only 24-hour place I knew. The rain didn't help. It was one of those oppressive, relentless autumn downpours that turns the roads into slick black mirrors. The wipers on my old sedan slapped back and forth, barely keeping up with the deluge. When I finally pulled into the strip mall parking lot, the laundromat was the only source of light. A beacon. A sterile, humming rectangle of white light cutting through the storm. I parked as close to the door as I could and dashed inside, the plastic bag slung over my shoulder. The heat hit me first. The humid, detergent-scented warmth wrapped around me like a damp towel. The air was thick with the smell of cheap bleach and artificial mountain breeze. The second thing I noticed was the noise, or rather, the lack of it. There were maybe 50 machines in the place, lined up in perfectly parallel rows. Old, dented commercial washers on the bottom, dryers stacked on top. Only one machine was running. It was all the way in the back corner, tumbling a load of dark clothes with a rhythmic, hypnotic thump. Thump. A squeak. Thump. I was entirely alone. The attendant's booth was dark and locked behind a heavy metal grate. The small television bolted to the ceiling in the corner was turned off, its screen reflecting the harsh overhead tubes. I shook the rain from my jacket, the droplets pattering against the worn linoleum floor, and walked to the middle aisle. I selected 2 large washers facing the front windows. I wanted to be able to look outside, to see my car, to have some tether to the outside world. I loaded the machines, poured the soap, pushed the quarters into the slots. The heavy clack of the coin mechanism sounded unnaturally loud in the empty room. Click, clack, show. The water hissed to life, filling the drum. I sat down in one of the attached plastic bucket seats near the window and pulled out my phone. The battery was at 14%. No charger. I sighed, turning the screen brightness all the way down, and began mindlessly scrolling through social media, the repetitive motion doing nothing to ease the underlying anxiety of being awake when the body demands sleep. 30 minutes passed. The rhythmic sloshing of my 2 washers blended with the distant thumping of the machine in the back. It became a kind of white noise, a lullaby of domesticity. The storm outside raged on, rain lashing against the massive plate glass windows, but inside I was warm. I was safe. I almost dozed off, my chin dropping to my chest, the phone slipping loosely in my grip. Then, the bell above the door jingled. I jolted upright, my heart doing a stutter step in my chest. I instinctively pulled my phone closer, the sudden adrenaline spiking through my veins. The door opened with a whine of hinges, letting in a gust of freezing, rain-swept air. A figure stepped inside. It was a tall man, wearing a dark, heavy trench coat. The coat was absolutely soaked. Water poured off the hem, pooling instantly on the linoleum. He didn't shake himself off. He didn't look around. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low over his face, casting a deep shadow that obscured any features. He held a large, black plastic trash bag in his left hand. I watched him from the corner of my eye, trying to look absorbed in my dead phone screen. At 3:45 a.m., any newcomer is an automatic threat until proven otherwise. He moved with a strange, stiff gait. He didn't walk towards the washers. He didn't go to the coin machine. He walked straight past my aisle and proceeded to the very back of the laundromat, right next to the single machine that had been running when I arrived. He stopped there, and he stood perfectly still. I held my breath, waiting for him to open a door, to load his clothes, to do anything that would signal normal human behavior. But he just stood there, facing the back wall, his back entirely to me. 10 seconds passed, then 20. A cold prickle of unease broke out across the back of my neck. I shifted in my plastic chair, the plastic squeaking loudly. He didn't react. He didn't even turn his head. He just stood there, the water dripping from his coat in a steady, rhythmic pattern that somehow managed to cut through the hum of the machines. Drip, drip, drip. Just a weird guy, I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible over the sloshing water. City's full of them, just ignore him. My washers clicked off, signaling the end of the cycle. I jumped at the sudden cessation of noise. It was time to move the clothes to the dryers. I stood up, grabbing my basket, and moved to the machines. As I pulled the heavy, wet fabric out, my eyes kept darting to the back of the room. He was still there, still standing, still facing the wall. I loaded 3 dryers, slammed the glass doors shut, and fed them quarters. The massive drums roared to life, a deep, rumbling bass that vibrated through the floorboards. The noise was comforting. It filled the silence. It drowned out the dripping. I went back to my seat. My phone was at 5%. I put it in my pocket, resigning myself to watching the rain. But my eyes wouldn't stay on the window. They kept drifting to the reflection in the glass. The laundromat was so brightly lit, and the night outside was so dark that the front windows acted as a perfect mirror, reflecting the entire interior of the room behind me. In the reflection, I could see my own face, pale and tired. I could see the rows of humming dryers, and I could see the back of the room. The man was no longer facing the wall. He had turned around. He was facing the front of the store, facing the back of my head. I felt the blood drain from my face. My stomach dropped into my shoes. I stared at the reflection in the window, terrified that if I turned around, I would break whatever fragile barrier of plausible deniability existed between us. He wasn't moving, but he was closer. He had been standing directly in front of the back row of washers. Now, he was standing at the end of the aisle. He had moved up at least 20 feet while my back was turned loading the dryers. Why didn't I hear him? The trench coat was heavy. His boots must be soaked. How did he move that far without making a single sound? I swallowed hard, my throat feeling like sandpaper. "Hey," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. I didn't turn around. I spoke to his reflection in the glass. "You waiting for a machine? Plenty open." No answer. Not a shuffle of feet, not a throat clearing, nothing. Just the rumbling of the dryers. Then one of my dryers hit the heavy spin cycle. A zipper or a button must have caught the metal drum because it started making a loud, rhythmic clanking noise. Clank, clank, clank. The sound was jarring, deafening in the enclosed space. I winced, reaching forward to try and open the door to readjust the load. I took my eyes off the reflection in the window for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds. I opened the dryer door. The drum stopped. The clanking ceased. I looked back at the window. He was halfway down the aisle. My breath hitched in my chest. He was less than 30 feet away now. He hadn't just walked. He had closed half the distance of the store in the 2 seconds the dryer had been clanking. And now I could see the details in the reflection. His coat wasn't just wet. It was slick with something darker, something that clung to the fabric heavily. The shadow of his hat still covered his eyes, but I could see the lower half of his face. His skin was gray, not pale, gray like concrete. And his jaw was slack, hanging open slightly in a way that looked entirely unnatural, as if the muscles had simply given up. He held the black plastic bag down by his side. It was dripping, too. A thick, dark liquid that hit the linoleum without a sound. My survival instincts, dormant until now, suddenly screamed at me to run. But the urban legend rule, the unspoken law of the late-night city, paralyzed me. If you are alone in a public place and someone behaves unnaturally, do not acknowledge them. Acknowledge the weird and you invite it in. Look them in the eye and you become their focus. Ignore it and maybe, just maybe, it will pass you by. I slowly, meticulously closed the dryer door. I pressed the start button. The drum roared back to life. I sat down in my plastic chair. I kept my eyes locked on the window reflection, my hands gripping the armrests so hard my knuckles turned white. I will not look at him. I will not turn around. Just 10 more minutes, I chanted in my head. Just 10 more minutes and my clothes are dry and I'm out of here. The dryer beside me clicked into its cooling cycle, the pitch of the motor changing to a higher whine. Then, the fluorescent lights above me flickered. The room plunged into darkness for a fraction of a second, then snapped back to harsh white. In the reflection, the man was standing at the end of my row. He was 10 feet away. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, a band of iron constricting my lungs. He was right there. I could smell him now. It wasn't the smell of rain. It was the smell of stagnant water, of old copper and wet earth, a metallic, rotting stench that made my stomach heave. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, his slack jaw hanging open, his head tilted slightly to the side, facing the back of my chair. The black bag in his hand was bulging. The lights flickered again. BZZT, BZZT. Every time the lights dipped, my panic spiked. The electrical hum of the ballast seemed to grow louder, angry, and erratic. Then, the final dryer clicked off. Silence. Absolute, profound silence fell over the laundromat. The sudden absence of the rumbling drums left my ears ringing. Without the noise of the machines, the only sound left in the room was the dripping. Drip, drip, drip. It was coming from right behind me. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I had to leave. Clothes be damned. Uniform be damned. I had to get to my car. I stood up slowly. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, staring at the front door. The keys were in my right pocket. The door was 20 feet away. I just had to walk. Don't run. Don't turn around. Just walk. I took a step. My wet rubber sole squeaked loudly against the linoleum. Behind me, another footstep echoed. A heavy, wet slap against the floor. I froze. He had moved. I took another step. Slap. He took a step. I was trapped in a nightmare game of Simon Says. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the smell of copper and rot overwhelming my senses. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The terror broke through the dam of logic. I broke the rule. I turned around. He was standing inches from my face. The hat was gone. His eyes were wide, lidless, staring blankly ahead. They were completely milk white, devoid of pupils. His mouth hung open, revealing a cavern of darkness. The skin of his face was bloated and waterlogged, peeling away in gray strips. He raised the black plastic bag slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. He just tipped the bag forward. A pile of soaked, dark clothing spilled out onto the floor between us. My clothes. The clothes from the single machine that had been running in the back corner. The clothes I hadn't put in. I looked down at the pile. Then I looked at the washer at the back of the room. Its door was open. I looked back at the man. He smiled, a slow, stretching grimace that tore the bloated skin at the corners of his mouth. I ran. I bolted. I hit the door. I slammed into the glass. I didn't stop. I pushed through the heavy metal frame, bursting out into the freezing storm. I didn't look back. I sprinted to my car, my fingers fumbling with the keys, the metal slipping in my panicked grip. I jammed the key into the lock, ripped the door open, and threw myself inside. I slammed the lock. I sat there, gasping for air, the rain pounding against the roof of the car like a million tiny fists. My hands were shaking so violently, I couldn't get the key into the ignition. I looked through the rain-streaked windshield at the laundromat. The lights inside were off. It was completely dark. The beacon in the storm was gone. I finally managed to start the car. The headlights flared to life, cutting through the heavy rain. They illuminated the front of the building. The door was standing wide open. And standing in the center of the doorway, illuminated by my headlights, was the man. He raised a single, bloated gray hand, holding up a wet hospital blue shirt, my uniform. I threw the car into reverse. I slammed the gas pedal. The tires spun, squealing against the wet pavement before catching and launching the car backward. I didn't stop accelerating until I was on the main road, the laundromat disappearing into the blackness behind me. I drove until my gas light came on. I drove until the sun came up. I never went back for my clothes. I quit my job at the hospital 2 days later, unable to wear the uniform without smelling the rotting copper, without feeling the damp cold of the laundromat. I moved to a building with in-unit laundry. I never go out past midnight. And whenever I walk past a laundromat, I listen. I listen for the hum of the machines. I listen for the clicking of quarters. But mostly, I listen for the dripping. Because I know that if I hear it, and the room goes silent, he's already closed the distance.